Servicing Jetsurf DFIs. Hey guys, welcome back to the channel and back to our workshop today. I've got an important video to do and one that I've been meaning to do for a long time, and that's servicing the late model DFI boards. I've got a really nice race DFI here. It's probably 18 months old, and I'd imagine the customer's done probably 25 hours on it based on what he's telling me. So the services we're going to do on this particular board is the same for all the DFI models. Whether it be an adventure, a race, a titanium, cruiser, the service procedure is the same, and we do have Jetsurf's recommended service procedure, and we'll go through that as we do the service. But the basic thing is, with these type of boards in Australian conditions, which are generally salt water, you want to have them serviced every 12 months, regardless of how many hours you've got. I've seen some boards that have had a lot of use in that 12-month period and are great, and some boards that have had very little use and not so good for the simple reason they're not getting used. So once every 12 months, Jetsurf recommends some major stuff every 50 or 100 hours, and we can go through that during the service procedure. But one thing I'd like to say is I probably don't do as many of these services as I'd like. Customers often do themselves, or they neglect to do the services. My suggestion is get them serviced more regularly. Most of the boards I see here these days have a problem, and a lot of them are to do with service-related issues. So if you get them serviced every 12 months, you're going to get a much better run and enjoy your board a lot more. But on another point, I'll be perfectly frank, these DFI boards are fabulous as far as reliability compared to some of the other products I've had, you know, jet skis and some of the earlier boards. The new DFIs are really, really good. Jetsurf's done a great job on those, and it's surprising how durable they are. But anyway, still need to get them serviced. So let's dive into it and we'll show you what needs to be done. Okay, let's get started. So first thing I do when a board comes in, I actually put it on the hose outside and I run it. That gives me an indication at the state the board is in when it arrives. So this particular one started and run fine. The customer has mentioned there is some sort of noise. I didn't hear it when the hose was running, but it's something, when I do the service, I'll look out for something that possibly may make a noise along the way. So anyway, we'll look at that. So we're going to start in the engine compartment. There's areas to service: the engine compartment, the jet unit, and the exhaust system. But anyway, we'll start under the engine compartment here, under the bonnet, as you want to call it, and let's get started. So first thing first, let's get the fuel tank out. So we just remove the fuel line and the power cable for the fuel pump, and then of course we whip out the fuel tank, and always grab that there when you lift them out. They don't get tangled up that way, and then pull that valve out. Now while we've got the tank here, generally the tanks are pretty maintenance free. One thing I do look for is garbage in the bottom of the tank, and this little valve here can cause issues. If it gets built up with salt, they actually block. So that's a test we'll do on that one later on. We'll look at the motor side of it first, but we'll look at the tank as we go along. So in here, things to look for as far as service stuff goes is the throttle cable and this starter clutch assembly. We'll obviously replace the spark plug as well. What we're going to do first, we're going to do a quick compression test on it, see what the health of the motor's like. I'd imagine it'd be fine in this case. So we remove this little red lock, which holds the spark plug cap on, and then we'll whip the cap off and tight, and then we'll grab the Jetsurf spanner. They're ideal because they're actually got the right bend in it, so it sits nicely in around the side of the hole there. Get that undone. And this can tell us what's going on in the engine too. That's another little problem with those. While we see that, if you use, say for example, a CRC spray or a petroleum based spray, these sort of things swell, and I've seen that one's torn as well. So what we'll do, we'll cable tie that on before we give it back. But what it does, it swells up all the rubber components like that. This one here, you can see that one's swollen as well. Yes, very much swollen. So this guy's obviously using a CRC product. I like to use Lennox, and I'll I'll give you a look here. I like to use this Lennox spray. Reason being, it's not petroleum based and it doesn't do this. It doesn't swell the rubbers. You can see that one there. That would be normally tight on the hose. That's well and truly swollen. And what it does, they swell and then they start to let water in places they shouldn't. In these two cases, that's not so bad. But anyway, petroleum based sprays aren't ideal. Lennox, it's a sheep's wool extract. Ideal for this sort of stuff. Doesn't damage any of the rubbers and things. So anyway, while we're there, let's get this plug out. I might remove this just so we're not knocking that around. That's obviously the fuel injector there, hence the DFI, direct fuel injection. Actually, that's wrong. It's actually digital fuel injection. I've been in trouble for that before. It is actually direct into the cylinder, but it's actually, DFI stands for direct fuel injection. Anyway, there's a plug. That looks very, very normal. It obviously hasn't been in there very long, but I'll put a new one in anyway. And as you can see, a little bit blacky brown around there. And yeah, that plug hasn't had much use at all. So that's in good condition. So that gives me a good indication the motor's good. So what I've got as far as compression testing goes, I've had to make up a special rig myself so I can actually do a compression test with it in the board. It's very difficult to get a hose in there to try and get that in to compression test it. So I've made up this little rig, which is a little BSP fitting on my compression tester. So that detaches from there. I've got this that screws into the spark plug hole. I'll screw that in. Get it so it's tight. That's it. And then we'll screw my compression tester on. Coolio. All right, we'll grab a lanyard. And we'll initialize the board. And I'll watch the compression gauge as I do it. We'll crank it over. Yeah, that one's great. That one's really good. And I'll take that off so you can see. So there's your compression test. As you can see, it's slowly leaking down. See, I've marked it at 140. 140 is my norm. In fact, that was about 150 before I took that off there. So that's well and truly above its norm. 140 to 150, and it depends on your compression gauge. They differ. So I find with this compression gauge, anything over 140 is great, and that one was, so sensational. Engine's in good condition, we don't have to worry about that. So what I'm going to do is we're going to start off with the starter clutch assembly. We'll get this off and check out what's going in there. So I like to just remove this tube out of the way there, and we'll grab an Allen key and we'll whip this cover off. Now, first indications of how well the board has been looked after and whether it's been lubricated properly, because obviously if you watch my previous videos, this area here needs to be lubricated every time you ride it. And Jetsurf suggests that this should be lubricated in saltwater use, and we're going to work on saltwater use every single use. They do recommend in freshwater use not so much, but they're saying the clutch in here, and based by their instructions they give me here, this should be replaced every 50 hours. I find they go longer than that, and all the recommendations that Jetsurf give me, including piston and ring replacements and stuff like that, so they're saying every 50 hours throw a ring in it, and every 100 hours put a piston in it. I'm inclined to run these boards to 100 hours with the piston and ring. Reason being is their recommendations are based around peak performance and often racing conditions. The average user won't notice that little bit of drop in power if the ring is run from 50 hours to 100. But if you're fussy with it, you know, we can throw a ring in it every 12 months. This one, we're not going to do a top end overhaul on it. Based on it's only done 25 hours, there's no need to touch it. Okay, to get this cradle off, we need a 5mm Allen key. I've got it on a little ratchet here. And these Worth ratchets, they're amazing. They work as a conventional ratchet, but you can also turn the spindle of the ratchet with the handle, and that's great for when you're in really tight places. So in this case, we'll undo the two primary engine mounts, which are easy to get to. These go onto the crankcases. Work that one out, and as you can see, when you get close to the end, I can just turn that handle. That's one. And then there's another one here on the cylinder head. That's another one out. We'll drop that washer, we'll get him again later. And then one under here. You can see how much easier this style of ratchet is for working in confined spaces. One's out. And one up this end as well. Okay, that's loose. Now what we do, and another good reason for removing this cradle, and I'll get that fuel pump hose out of the way, is gives us access to the throttle cable, which will lubricate as well. So what we do down here is you've got your throttle drum, and on the throttle drum is I guess your nipple on the end of the cable. You turn that around and it just fell out, which is great. There's a little slot and that just pops out, so that way then we can pull that cradle out of the way and bring the throttle cable with us. So easy enough to get to lubricate in the future. We'll pick up all the little bolts and bods floating around, so none gets left in the bottom. It's nothing worse than one of them ending up down a carburetor. If you lose it, that's pretty bad. In this case, throttle body. All right, so what we're going to do now, we've got to take the idle gear off before we can get the main gear off. So that's fairly simple. There you go. And I just put another key in between the gears to lock them up. And you simply undo that key. Cool. Little bolts off. And this should just wriggle off. Sometimes you need to give it a little bit of a helping hand. That'll wriggle. And work it off. It's on a little square drive, which is almost a press fit, which is great. So as you can see, it sits on a little square drive there. Beautiful. Then from there, we remove the end cap off the gear. So we use a socket for that. So it's a 32mm socket. And again, we lock the gear off. And this is just on an O-ring, so it's not as if it's going to be overly tight. We just undo the nut on the end. Should have it. Yep. Cool. The first thing you look in there is make sure it's not been overheated or dry or anything in there. And that looks really good. So then we remove the nut onto there. Now this is attached to the end of the crankshaft, so we've got to secure the crankshaft, and I find the easiest way to do that is put an Allen key into the hex drive of the socket there that holds the coupling, and then undo this one, and they can be tight. Yep, that's got him. These have got to be held on nicely because you don't want that coming off. This thing coming off while it's running along is not ideal. Cool. Off with the bolt. Let's get this gear off now. So that just should, yep, by rights just pull off. And so basically what you've got in there is a seal, a one-way bearing, and another bearing on the other end. As you can see, that one looks in lovely condition. And we'll check out the shaft. One thing to look for too is this seal. If they've had a lot of use, that seal tends to wear, or sometimes it'll even pop out. So I've got one here to show you here. This is what it looks like with the one with the seal missing. See, there's the seal gone, and what you'll find is the seal will still be stuck in on the shaft. So just be aware of that. Check that out. And if the seal is stuck in there, just flick it out and just check that the main bearing cage is in good condition, because what can happen is if those seals pop out, it can run up on the cage and it can actually damage the cage or even melt it in some conditions and allows the balls to float around. So as you can see, that one's in good condition, so that's fine. We'll also give the shaft a bit of a wipe, that are clean. And as you can see, that's in lovely condition. You can't feel any grooves or any damage on it. So if that's badly worn or grooved, well, unfortunately we have to change the crankshaft, but this one's lovely. So what we'll do with that, we'll do it later on. We'll grease it up and reassemble that. That's all fine. The other thing you want to do too is there's a seal in there on the outer edge. You want to grease that too, but we'll look at that when we reassemble it. Lovely. Okay, so the next step is we're going to lubricate this throttle cable. So what we do, this is a motorcycle style throttle cable lubricator. The idea is you slip it over the cable, clamp it up, and then you put an aerosol can with some lubricant spray through the hole, force it through the cable, and when it comes out the handle, you know you get it right through. But what I find is these Jetsurf cables are a little bit smaller than motorcycle cables, and you'll see in there there's steps in there, and I like to put a little bit of tape around the end of the cable, and that just builds up the end of the cable so that it actually grips onto the throttle lubricator better, and it saves a lot of wastage and helps force the lubricant through the cable because there's a better seal here. So it's a simple matter of just run a bit of insulation tape around there. I've got the red stuff, that's always fast. That'll do. And that builds it up to about the size of what a normal motorcycle cable would be. And that end of the cable sits in there nicely, and then you've got a little slit in there. And then these double ones, you can buy singles and doubles. I find the doubles work better because you can clamp the cable that end, and then you can clamp the inner cable that end and puts even pressure on them. So that's good, that's ready to go. Okay, so here's the spray I use. I actually use this rust off lubricant. It's designed to penetrate rusty bolts, and it leaves a graphite finish or graphite I guess residual when it's finished. So the great thing is it's very light, it's very penetrable, and it leaves the graphite. And the ideal thing is to have the graphite in the cables. So this is what I use. Oops, end's fallen off. And that's again another Worth product. You European guys will love this because that's where it's made. It's not super cheap over here, but it is good stuff. So we poke that into the hole there, like that. And we'll get a rag because this gets messy. Wrap that around that, and then we inject it in the cable. And eventually, you'll see it, fingers crossed, come out this end piece here. Now this cable was not too bad, but you could had signs of it starting to stick. And I can hear it hissing out that end. Let's see. Yep, it's coming through. Alrighty, that's got it through the cable. And what I'll do as well is I'll spray down in the little gap there, around the handle, And then we'll take the clamp off. And you can see that dripping out of there. So if you hold that cable, yeah, it's nice and free. And just work the lubricant through it. It's all good. That's it. So that's how that's done. So the other things we look for whilst we're doing the service is there's 2 O-rings here in the exhaust, and we look for excessive oil or a black spray on the engine somewhere. So if this has been leaking, what you find is you get black oil, two-stroke oil, burnt two-stroke oil splattering all over the engine, and it looks very obvious when it's sitting on the cylinder. So you'll see these black splatches everywhere, and you'll find it's very, very, very dirty. But as you can see, rubbing my finger around that, clean as. So that's in good condition. The other thing you want to look at the coupling. They tend not to wear out. I've never seen a set of couplers worn out. But what you want to do is just make sure it's got a bit of gap, and then make sure, you can see that's turning freely there. Now that bearing in the back there sounds a little dry. We'll give that a lubricate as well. So in down on the board there, and I'll get the camera down in a minute, there's a bearing down there that's got to be lubricated as well. So those O-rings are good, coupling's good, and let's have a look at the bearing next. Okay, so you get the drive shaft bearing down there, which you can see in there. It's an open bearing, which when I first saw that, I thought that was really unusual. But it's a stainless steel bearing, and what we find is it actually lasts longer, providing it's well lubricated, than one that has a sealed bearing, which tends to build up moisture and fail over time. So there's a video on how to replace those. In fact, there's videos on all these bits and pieces as far as the engines go. I'll put them in the comments, put them in the description so you get an idea. So anyway, that bearing there needs lubricating. I generally use my Lennox spray, and you can do the bearing there, or the newer versions have the bearing lubricator just here. So you force that through until you see the lubrication come through the bearing, and then what you'll find is that seems a lot smoother there now. Yeah, that's much better. Lennox is good. Spray greases are very, very good as well, and probably a little better than that. I've always got Lennox on hand, but if you've got Lennox or spray greases, that's ideal for that bearing. But I use Lennox. I do it every time. I put on that bearing and that clutch gear assembly, no problem at all. Okay, next thing we do is we do the exhaust valve. This is pretty simple. We just grab ourselves a 5mm Allen key, unscrew the screw in the end, and I see this one's not sitting in properly either, so see it was hanging out of that O-ring there, so we'll sort that out while we're at it. I'll undo that, and oh yeah, I see why. There's meant to be a copper ring on there. Someone's put a nylon washer of some kind, and it's obviously not pulling it in tight enough, so we'll change that. That's just a aluminium pipe that directs the flow of the exhaust from out of the end of the ball valve down into the rod plate. The cavity around the jet pump muffles the noise, and then the water and exhaust comes out through the nozzle. Pretty simple. So you check the O-ring on there. There's another little O-ring on there which look okay, and then we pop out the ball and spring by just unscrewing the end cap like that. There's the spring. There's the ball there. As you can see, it's all gummy, and we'll have a look up the hole. There is a seal in there, which I'll bring the camera down so you can have a look. Okay, we'll get the torch there so you can see. And as you can see, it's a plastic housing, and it has a seal in the end, and you can see the seal. That's it there. It looks in good condition. I'll give that a quick wipe out, and you can have a better look at it when I clean it out. So the idea is the seal sits in the end there. The ball presses against the seal when the engine's not running, and it prevents the water running back into the exhaust. Now, what happens is if these build up with too much carbon, or the board exhaust is overheated, the ball melts or the seal gets damaged, water gets back into the engine. So if you're finding getting water into your engine quite regularly for no real reason, that's generally the issue. There's the ball. We'll give him a clean up as well. As you can see, they're normally meant to be white, but they go black from all the carbon and whatnot. Clean that up. And then, as you can see, the seal's in good condition, so the ball goes in, it pushes against the seal, stops the water coming up through the exhaust. Alrighty, let's put this silencer and ball valve assembly back together. So what we've got is the spring. I like to give the spring a little bit of a stretch. I find they do close up a little bit with the heat and whatnot, so don't get too carried away. Too much pressure will cause the ball to be a little bit tight, so just a little stretch. The other thing to watch with the ball and spring, and as you can see, I've just wiped this down with a rag. The spring has two different ends to it. So one end where the ball sits nice and comfortably, and the other end, the ball will actually slip inside. Now, as you can imagine, if that's in there, the ball slips inside the spring, the whole valve won't work properly, obviously, because the ball won't touch against the seal. So set it up so the ball and spring are like that, as it sits there. Then, I probably didn't show you before when I disassembled it, but this is in three different pieces, the end cap. So you've got one section that screws in first, like that. Firm. Then you have an eccentric. The idea with the eccentric is to help to line the silencer up with the ride plate to the exhaust outlet. Obviously these are handmade, so they're not all exactly the same, so they use that eccentric there. So make sure you've got the cavity so that the silencer can sit in it on the outside. We'll put our ball and spring in first, put that plate on there, and then we spin that on. But don't do it tight, because you want to be able to turn that eccentric around to line up the holes. So we get our silencer, and I'll get a bit of spray, bit of squirt on the O-rings, like that. So I like to insert it to the ride plate first, and then we can play around with the eccentric. So that needs to go right down by the look of that one. Around the eccentric to line it all up. So there, that's good. And then what I've done is I put a new washer on there. It had a nylon washer for some reason. Someone had put a different washer on it. So whack that in there. So we've got that tight. We'll make sure that's in the board there. It's lined up with eccentric. And we'll tighten that up. Like that. And then once that's tight, do up that ring around there. And the job's done. Now the next thing we'll do while we're here as well, inside the end of the jet pump, inside the jet pump housing is a set of bearings, and they have grease in them. So there's an end cap in here, and what we do, we put our 5mm Allen key in the end cap, undo it, it's just plastic, undo the end cap, screw that off, and then we look in there, and oh, that's really good. You can see it's got nice green grease in there. And if we look up inside here, yeah, that's in lovely condition there with grease everywhere. I'm not going to touch that. That's in lovely condition. What you're looking for in there is any moisture or water that pours out. If there's moisture or water pours out, the jet pump's got to be removed, and we've got to put new bearings and seals in it. The other thing to watch here is see this O-ring. It's not sitting in place from when I've undone it. Make sure that O-ring sits in there properly. I'll get rid of that torch. Sits in the groove, and make sure it's got grease around it. We'll pinch a bit of grease there. Grease her up. And that's beautiful. We'll put that back in. There we go, threads lined up. Coolio, and then we'll tighten that up. All right, and the last thing while we're down in this area, we'll check all the ride plate bolts and the fin bracket bolts. So I'll get my smaller Allen key here, and we just run around and just make sure they're all tight. So far they feel good. And a whole bunch all the way around. Just make sure they're tight. So that's the ride plate and then the fin bracket as well. Yep, they're all good. I have seen a few of these come loose, but they look great. All right, so that's got the jet pump, the ride plate, and the exhaust valve and silencer sorted. On to the next bit. Then the other important thing is the impeller. And what we find, these are carbon fibre impellers, which are fantastic and very strong, but they're like anything. If they cop any knocks or hits, they will get damaged. So I can see in there that's in lovely condition. You look at the leading edge of the blades, and if you want to, they're not terribly sharp. You can get your hand in there and run your finger over the edge of the blades and feel any chips or dings or any marks in it. That one's in lovely condition. I'll get you one to give you an idea what it looks like when it's out. I've got one here, I'll grab it. Okay, so here's an impeller I dragged out of the back, and it's a damaged one. As you can see, the leading edge of the blades have been damaged and the carbon fibre is peeled off. You can see that one there and there, a big ding in that one. So that one's had a bit of a knock. Just for example, if you look at this side, that's somewhat what it should look like if it's in good condition, and that's how they come. So if we have to change the impeller, we do a complete impeller shaft assembly. We use the genuine Jetsurf ones. So that's what they look like if they're damaged, but the one we got's great, so good stuff. Alrighty, well let's get this clutch back together. So obviously this one is in good condition, only 24 hours, lovely. So what we'll do, we'll grease it up, but what I'll do first, you've probably seen some other videos that I've done on these clutches, and the grease I've used in there was what I could get here in Australia at the time. It was an EP2 grease. I've now sourced the proper Kluger grease that Jetsurf used when they put them together. So this particular grease is a Kluger LDS 18 special grease. So it's obviously what they've worked out is best for the job, so we'll use that. So I keep tubes of that here in stock. It's not super cheap, but it's not stupid expensive either, and like a tube of that will last forever. So what we do is get the grease around the seal. This is important. And one thing too, I find, don't over grease them as well, because that can create a lot of heat if there's too much grease in there and no room for expansion. So I give them a good grease, and what I've done prior to this is obviously I've wiped the old grease out of it. I just did it on the bench with a rag. I find if you wash it with solvent, it's difficult to get the solvent out. And then we'll put some in this bearing in the end here. Like that. It's all greased up nice. And of course, put a bit of grease on the seal. There's a big seal around the back there. Run some more grease around that. And we'll put a little smear on here as well. Probably getting a bit carried away there. Or a little bit, that's a bit too much. A little bit around there. And what we'll do with this excess that I have on my finger, we'll put that into the end cap. We'll put a little bit in there around the O-ring and thread when we put that back together. Lovely. So that's the good to go back on. Stick that on there. Push it right in. Line the gear up there. Push it right into the seal, and then you can test it. It obviously spins one way freely and locks the other way and spins the crankshaft. That's how it should work. All right, cool. So wipe any excess grease back into that bearing. Bit on the thread, and then we'll get the nut. Okay, very important when you put this back together, use a bit of Loctite. I like the blue Loctite's the best. The 243 blue. And a bit on the thread This is sort of Loctite you can get back apart again afterwards. There are some what we call permanent assembly Loctites you can use. But this will be fine for this job. That's tight, and then again we want to hold this shaft with a key. We'll do him up nice and tight. That's him. Lovely. Alright, end cap can go on. Still got this here. And I'll just put a tool through there. Just lock that up. Help me tighten it. That's it. You don't want it too tight. And then the idle gear. And of course the little bolts as well, so I like to put a little bit of Loctite on the gear. There's a press fit, but that just helps hold it on. I have seen a few of these come off if they're not tightened properly. So I get that onto the hex. Line that up. Yep, that's starting. That's on. Loctite on the thread. She is. Again, lock it off through the gears. Nice and tight. Beautiful. Now, let's get this engine cradle on. So we want to remove the tape on the cable we used before from the lubricator. This cable sits on the top of the crankcases in the position where this tape is, so we want to get that out of the way. That's there. We'll get this up there. So get the rail back down in position. First thing you want to do is put the cable back on the cable drum. So you pull it wide open to full throttle, put the little barrel into the hole through the slot, which have gone too far, and through there, and then close the throttle and just make sure the throttle cable sits back down in the groove. Don't let it get caught on there. Now the next step is there's a little tab under here, and then there's the boss for the crankcases. So the cable's got to go under the tab, which you can feel down under there. I'll lift the engine to make it easier for myself. Yep, behind the tab, and then on top of the crankcases, like that. I'll get a photograph of that right now so you can check that out. Okay, next step is you've got these two little spindles that hold the engine cradle to the crankcases and cylinder. You're looking for the spindle with the big flange on it, and the idea with the big flange is holds that throttle cable on top of that throttle cable, throttle of the crankcase boss, and the other one's for the other end. So we'll whack that one in first. So they go neatly into the engine cradle like that. And then on this end, you want the long bolt with the tab on it, which holds the fuel pump hose. So we put that in place, and there is a tag where it sits. So you want to have it that way with the tag inserted into the engine cradle. And I'll get that lined up, and a little Allen key here to help me. There we can get that started on the crankcases. Now just do that a little bit because you've got to get the one on the other end. If you go too tight with that, you can't get this one in. So we'll put the one in the other end, and what I find, a pair of long nose pliers helps out with this one. Hold that there, get the bolt so you can get it in place down between the cable and the bracket. Line that up in there, bolt in. Allen key to help me get started. It's got him. It's in place, and we'll just double check that we have the throttle cable in the right position, which is which is good. And we'll see. Yep, throttle works fine. Good stuff. All right, let's get them tightened up. So I'll get my groovy worth tool onto them. And these two you can tighten up before you do the other two engine mounts. It's always been a rule of thumb in mechanics, always tighten the bolts up once they're all in, but these are not connected as such as if you were putting a gearbox or something like that on. I'll tighten them up. Boom. All right, then there's the two bolts for either end. One there. And you lift the engine until it lines up. I'll come around this side, get this one in. Boom, that's got that one. And this one. Got him. Then we'll put this fuel hose back on there like that, and then the cover sits on top there. All right, well, all we've got left to do is do the fuel tank. Yep. Okay, so obviously the other things you've got to check is bindings, your tether on your handle, handle fixture fittings, your snorkel, any of the hull around the seams and any damage around that. So the things to look for is bindings tend to tear around the bolts, and these little plastic fittings either side, if they're stepped on or forced, they'll break as well. So we check those. Obviously all the straps, that looks all good. Same here, straps and fittings are all good. We check the cable, and this one here is in good condition. It's not frayed or knocked around. If that's damaged, we'll replace that, but that's all good. So that's fine, throttle's working properly. Handles are in place. What can happen too, and some of the older boards, these snorkels will tear around this flexible joint here. So we check that out, that's all good. There's a little tube on the tether cord there, we'll push into there. And then I just have a good look around the board, just make sure there's no damage, no bad grooves in the bottoms. I've seen on some of the older boards, if the fuel tanks aren't fitted correctly, they actually rub, and they'll actually physically rub right through the bottom of the board, which is weird, but I've seen it in the jet ski game as well. So keep an eye on that. If you do have any fiberglass damage on these boards, I've got people that can repair the carbon fiber, and I keep in a special epoxy that I can use too for just minor repairs, nicks and dings and things like that. So that can all be done. So I think the next step is we'll do a test on this fuel tank. I'll drain the fuel out of it. We'll test it as far as the non-return valve in it, and then we can put it back in and wipe my grubby hands off it and finish it up. So anyway, let's get into the tank. Okay, last thing here is the fuel tank. So what I've done, I've drained all the fuel out of it, Now, it's difficult to see from the camera, but we just do a basic inspection on what's going on in the tank. You'll see, and it's probably very hard to see from the camera, in there is what we call a tea bag, which is actually a filter for the fuel pump. We quickly have a look at that just to see if it's crusty looking. That looks in really good condition. And then we just look for any debris and any junk in the bottom of the tank. If there's junk in the bottom of the tank, what we do is get in there with a screwdriver and a rag, and we mop that all up. And if the tea bag and fuel pump's damaged, there's not a lot we can do with that. You can't buy a fuel pump or the filter, you've got to buy a tank complete, but I've never had any problems with that. That's all good. The only issues we have with the tanks, obviously, is this one-way valve, as I mentioned at the beginning, and they tend to block with salt and that in it. So what I do a little test on them. The idea with the valve is obviously you put fuel in the tank, and as the engine uses the fuel up, air needs to come back into the tank to fill up the gap. So if this valve is blocked, what happens is the fuel comes out and creates a vacuum in the tank. The tank tends to suck in, and it gets to a point where it can't pull any more pressure, and the board starts to stop. So that's a problem. The other problem is if the valve is completely jammed wide open and fuel pours out. So what I would do is do a little test to see if fuel pours out. This one is in good condition, it's fine. But if you've got an old tank and you want to just make sure that valve's okay, keep the fuel in it, give it a wriggle, and see if any fuel comes out. This one will be fine. But the important thing is make sure the valve is operating. So what I do is I put my little pop-off tester on it, and I blow air into it. And it is slowly going in, see that? And I'll make sure that's in place properly. But as you can see, the air is going back to the tank. And it doesn't rush in. It's a very tiny valve. But as you can see, that's dropping off. That's fine. But if that held, for example, if I got that and I kink that over, I'll try it there, and I pump it up, and if it stayed, we'd know we got a blockage, but we haven't. So anyway, that tests out okay. So that tank is all good. Let's bang it back in. All right, let's get that fuel tank back in place. So tuck this lead down in there for that. We better put that one back on, and I'm going to fix that up, and I'm going to put a cable tie around that to tie that fuel injection hose up. Let me do that now. Put this around here. They normally sit on nice and neatly, but this will fix it. Get that off. Okay, let's get this tank in here. So we've tested the valve, done all that sort of stuff. We'll put the breather tube on the back. Now keep in mind, you don't get this breather tube kinked behind the strap. So what I do is I get the back strap. I make sure the tube is behind the strap, not in front of the strap. Behind it like that. The front strap up here out of the way. Slide that back into position. Like that. Strap back on. I always put the electrical hose on, electrical wire on first because it's easier, it's at the bottom. Then the fuel injection hose. And boom, that's sorted. So what I would do next, throw some fuel in it, test run it, and go from there. Although I do see we've got to put a spark plug in it yet, so we'll do that. So last thing, use spark plug. So make sure you put the right one in. It's important that you get the right one in. So I use NGKs, and they're a BPR 7HS. And you can tell the difference between these and the plugs for the earlier models is it's a lot longer plug. The plugs for the carbureted boards are much, much shorter. So that's them. So BPR 7HS is the GO. Jetsurf tool. You don't have to do them too tight. Just about a quarter of a turn from when they seat's all you need. Doing plugs coming from this side. hand around in there better. Let's go here. Boom, it's on. And now, these caps, I see a lot of people put them on wrong. I actually see them put them on this way, which I don't know what they think that's going to do, but that doesn't work. They've got to go on this way. So that piece there sits around the hex on the spark plug, and that holds the cap on. So make sure you put them back in that way, like that. Awesome. All good. Alrighty, well, that board's all back in one piece. All the mechanical work's done. All we need to do now is run it outside. I'm going to put the hose on it, run the water through it, run the engine, make sure it runs correctly, check for engine mounts to see they're all good. These late model ones don't have too much issues with engine mounts. The older ones, we keep an eye on the engine mounts. We look for water leaks. We make sure that it's cooling correctly so that you see water coming through the exhaust. Make sure it's running through the telltale correctly. And just that everything works right. So that's the next step there. What I will do is I'll put a copy of this just after I finish chatting, so you can have a little look at what they recommend. I think they're a little bit on the cautious side as far as that goes. I run the boards a little bit longer than that, as I've said in certain areas. So anyway, that one's sorted. We'll get that back to the customer after he's done. I'm sure he'll be happy, and it's ready for the next summer. So if you guys are looking to do any service work like that, more than happy to help you with it. Or if you want to do it yourself, we can supply any parts and bits and bobs you need. Keep you on the water. So anyway, please, if you can, subscribe. And I've got a lot of great comments over the last few months on how good the videos are and how informative they are. So I'll continue to do them as long as I get people watching them. So anyway, thanks guys. We'll see you in the next one. Bye now.